Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a real perfect storm of history, a wild 5-year crisis that brought the centuries-old Ottoman Empire right to the edge of complete and total collapse. So, how does something so big fall apart so fast? Well, it wasn't just one thing. Think of it more like a terrifying pileup on a highway. You had internal decay, a complete economic meltdown, and hungry neighbors all crashing into each other at the exact same time. All right, let's set the scene. We're going to rewind to just before the whole crisis kicks off. On the surface, things might have seemed okay, but if you looked closer, the foundations of the empire were already starting to crack. Inside the empire, you had this massive tug of war going on. On one side, you've got the young Ottomans. These guys were idealists, reformers, who were pushing for a modern constitution, a parliament, a real democracy. But pulling hard in the other direction was the Sultan himself, Abdelaziz, who was becoming more and more paranoid and was dead set on grabbing all the power for himself. At the same time, the world outside was changing, and not in a good way for the Ottomans. The brand new Suez Canal meant Britain and France were suddenly way more interested in Egypt. Then, the Ottomans' main ally, France, gets absolutely crushed by Prussia, leaving a huge power vacuum. And who rushes in to fill it? Their oldest rival, Russia. Russian influence in Istanbul grew so strong that the Sultan's top advisor was even mockingly called Nadimov, because everyone knew he was in the Russian ambassador's pocket. The empire was quickly finding itself all alone. So while all these political games were being played, an economic time bomb was ticking. And as it so often happens in history, it was money, or, a sudden catastrophic lack of it, that really lit the fuse for the whole disaster. And look, this wasn't just a minor recession. It was one domino knocking over the next. First, a terrible famine in Anatolia, the empire's heartland, completely wipes out farms and livestock. So, naturally, government tax money just dries up. And what does the government do? They raise taxes on the people who are already starving. Just brutal. Then, to make matters even worse, a global stock market crash hits, so they can't borrow any more money from Europe. The last domino was inevitable. The Ottoman state officially went bankrupt. And the size of the debt they were in, it's just staggering. 200 million pounds. I mean, that's an absolutely astronomical amount of money for the 1870s. There was just no way they could pay it back. The empire's credit was totally shot. Now, a financial crisis like this never just stays in the account books, right? It spilled out onto the streets, sparking rebellions and completely tearing the government apart from the inside out. So, the bankrupt government starts trying to squeeze its provinces for every last penny to pay its debts. And the Balkans, which hadn't been hit by the famine, just exploded. Christian peasants in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Bulgaria rose up in a massive rebellion against these new crushing taxes. The Ottoman response was horrifyingly brutal. We're talking about the Bulgarian massacres, where an estimated 15,000 civilians were killed. The news sent shockwaves of horror across Europe. In Britain, it became this huge political scandal, and public opinion turned viciously against the Ottomans. Suddenly, they weren't just seen as bankrupt, they were seen as barbarians. And while all that was happening, the capital city, Istanbul, just descended into pure chaos. I mean, look at this timeline from 1876. It's insane. In May, Sultan Abdelaziz is overthrown in a coup. A few days later, he's dead. Then, in June, some rogue officer walks into a cabinet meeting and murders 2 government ministers. The new Sultan, Murat V, has a complete mental breakdown and is removed from power after only 3 months. It was a complete and utter meltdown of the state. Out of this absolute whirlwind of chaos steps Abdul Hamid II. Get this, he's the 3rd Sultan in less than 4 months, and he inherits an empire that's broke, in open rebellion, and whose government has completely disintegrated. The job in front of him was, well, pretty much impossible. So, with the Ottoman Empire on its knees, broke, politically shattered, and its army tied up with rebellions, its oldest and most dangerous rival, Russia, saw its moment. This was the chance they had been waiting for. The Ottomans tried one last, desperate diplomatic move. While all the great powers of Europe were meeting in Istanbul to figure out how to force reforms on them, the Ottomans suddenly announced they had a brand new constitution. The message was basically, hey, no need to force reforms on us, we're doing it ourselves. But it was too little, too late. Nobody bought it. With that diplomatic card played and lost, Russia decided it was time for war. Back home, this idea of pan-Slavism, of uniting all Slavic peoples, was at a fever pitch. Russia cleverly cut a deal with Austria-Hungary, basically saying, stay out of this and you can have Bosnia-Herzegovina. And so on April 24, 1877, Russia invaded. The Ottoman army actually put up a surprisingly tough fight, especially at a place called Plevna. But once that fortress fell, the Russian army just couldn't be stopped. The defeat was total, and the price the empire had to pay for this whole 5-year crisis wasn't going to be in money anymore. It was going to be paid in land, huge chunks of it, all carved up in 2 major peace treaties. The war ended with the Russian army camped out at San Stefano, which is basically a suburb of Istanbul today, just 12 kilometers from the Sultan's palace. I mean, they were literally at the gates. With a knife at their throat, the Ottomans were forced to sign a peace treaty that was an absolute disaster. But here's where it gets even messier. The other big European powers saw Russia's treaty and freaked out. Russia wanted to create this huge Bulgarian state that would basically be their puppet. Britain and Austria said, no way. So they forced a new meeting, the Congress of Berlin. Now, their goal wasn't to help the Ottomans, not at all. It was to weaken Russia and grab a piece of the pie for themselves. So, as you can see, Bulgaria gets shrunk way down, Austria gets to occupy Bosnia, and Britain just goes ahead and takes the island of Cyprus. The Ottoman Empire was just carved up like a turkey to keep everyone in Europe happy. So, by 1878, the storm finally passed. The Ottoman Empire was still standing, but it was just a shadow of what it once was. It was smaller, poorer, weaker, and now parts of it were literally occupied by the same countries that claimed they were just trying to keep the peace. The empire survived the crisis, sure, but it was left with a huge lingering question. Was it still in control of its own destiny, or had it just become a pawn in someone else's much bigger game?